Hey guys, welcome to the Ramsey Paul Show. I hope you're having a great weekend. It's Saturday, August 23rd, and this is a Ramsey Paul Show. We do the top 5 news stories of the day, or at least the top 5 I'm interested in. So if you like this, we're growing the channel. Thank you. Like and subscribe. Send it to your friends. All right. The first story has to do with Chairman Trump. Remember Chairman Mao? Yeah, Chairman Trump. He's gone full commie. The government controlling the means of production. Well, not quite. But it looks like that Trump said we're going to get a 10%, the United States, investment in Intel. And let's take a look here at his announcement. This won't make the libertarian people happy. That's for sure.
About the 10%? About the 10%. Yeah, I met a man. He was a very nice man, and I called for his removal because I saw something by a man named Tom Cotton, a senator from
I like his hat. Trump was right about everything. Was that it? Trump was right about everything. That's kind of a lot to put on a hat. I'll have to get one of those hats.
Arkansas. He's a great guy, friend of mine, supporter of mine, big supporter. I'm a supporter of his too. And he wrote a pretty nasty story about the head of Intel. And I said, well, if that's right, he should resign. And he came in, he saw me, we talked for a while. I liked him a lot. I thought he was very good. I thought he was somewhat a victim, but nobody's a total victim, I guess. And I said, you know what? I think the United States should be given 10% of Intel. And he said, I would consider that. I said, well, I'd like you to do that because Intel has been left behind, as you know, compared to Jensen and some of our friends, NVIDIA, some of the people because Intel should have never been. Intel was the biggest, most powerful chip company in the world. And then they started leaving and they started going to foreign countries, in particular Taiwan. And if we had a president who would have said, okay, you can go to Taiwan, but we're going to put a 100% tariff or 200 or 300 or 500% tariff. Anybody that sells into the United States has to pay. They wouldn't have left.
Yeah, that's true. And I think the same thing should be done about outsourcing to India. I saw that in the tech industry. That shouldn't happen.
They would have never left and we wouldn't have. So in the meantime, we had people that were, in some cases, good politicians that weren't good on trade. I loved that man, but he was not good on trade. I totally disagreed. He allowed the car industry to be taken out of this country. We lost 50% of our car industry. But that's all coming back. It's all coming back. But if somebody would have said that with Intel, would be a giant right now. Now, with that, they've had some bad management over the years, and they got lost. And I said, I think you should pay us 10% of your company. And they said, yes. That's about $10 billion. I don't get it. This comes to the United States of America. And I said, I think it would be good having the United States as your partner. He agreed. And they've agreed to do it. And I think it's a great deal for them. And I think it's a great deal. He walked in wanting to keep his job, and he ended up giving us $10 billion for the United States. So we picked up $10 billion. And we do a lot of deals like that. I'll do more of them. If somebody has, like we have restrictive covenants with Jensen. We have, it's NVIDIA. And to unrestrict the covenant, nothing to do with losing our powers or military or anything, because that I wouldn't do. But there are things you can do that don't affect us, that actually help us. And if we're going to give somebody a restricted covenant, we have a strong restrictive covenant on certain industries.
So what Trump is saying here, and I know this will outrage a lot of the purist free market type people, but what Trump is doing, and the reason he's doing it is a couple of reasons. So the most is so that the United States has an influence in Intel to make sure that Intel stays an American company. And part of this has to do with national security, because if you have this total open free trade, which we've had, what happens is we've had all our manufacturing go overseas. And the idea, the libertarian model, well, that's good because they can do it cheaper. That means cheaper microprocessors. So you can buy your laptops and everything else cheaper. So it's good for the consumer. And we do, information space, and all the dirty work can be done over in China. That is the theory that the United States has been under for the past, I don't know, 30, 40 years. There's been some pushback. I know Pat Buchanan pushed back against it. Ross Perot did. He warned about what would happen. But in general, that's been the theory. And what has happened is a lot of the manufacturing has gone overseas. Now, the problem with that is almost all modern weapons, missiles, and so forth, they require microchips. And if your enemy has control over them all, you're screwed, right? You're screwed. You can't make one of these plants like overnight. So let's say if China should do a sneak attack on Taiwan and take it, and we would have no access now to important chips to run our military. We'd be just devastated. So that is a component of it too. That's just a security component. But there's also, you lose good paying jobs, and that's another aspect of it that you can't just brush aside. Yes, things are cheaper, but as we've seen in America, what has happened with so-called free trade, the rich have got a lot richer, but the poor, there's been a lot more poor, and the middle class is disappearing. The old days, you have your blue collar workers that could afford a decent home, provide for a family. Those people are going away. So you either make it big and have a lot of money, or you're pretty much on government assistance or just trying to get by with service type of jobs. That's not for a healthy country. And I think Trump understands that. Now, when you get into ideology, this is where it gets really interesting, because I know on my thumbnail, I think I'm going to show Trump as, the old communist propaganda of the 1930s and the Soviets. And no, I'm not saying this is a communist idea. It really isn't, because in communism is collective state ownership. There's no private property, right? And that's not the situation here. 90% of Intel is still based, is owned privately. It's just 10%. And this isn't the first time the United States has got involved with private business or purchase ownership of part of private business. When General Motors was about to go bankrupt, the United States did temporarily, because General Motors was such a big industry in America, we didn't want to see it fall apart. And then we transitioned it back to General Motors. And I think the first time was like 1905, the Panama Railways, the United States had 100% ownership in. So it has happened. And it's usually because of national security reasons. But this isn't a temporary thing. My understanding with Trump, it's not like GM where we're just trying to get an ownership of the company to make sure it stays afloat and give it back. It's we want a permanent stake in Intel for a variety of reasons, to make sure they stay in America, and also for national security reasons. So it's not really a communist system, because the communist system, you don't have any private property, you don't have Intel, you'd have the United States just create a chip plant. And it's technically not really socialism, because socialism is a mix of state and private ownership. But this is technically, and it's a form of fascism. And I hate to say fascism, because everyone thinks, because the propaganda, when you hear fascism, you think of tanks and concentration camps and goose stepping and uniforms. But fascism, throw that all away, right? Fascism is just an economic system where you have private ownership, but you have state control. And this is basically a fascist type of model. I know, oh no, no, that's not, again, you don't have to have the other stuff with fascism. I mean, you can, but you don't have to. It's just an economic model where the people own things privately, but the government, for the good of the nation, can control it. And this is different than, let's say, communism, whereas in communism, the government owns all the private property. So it's really a form of fascism economically. And another country that does this all the time now is China. China is no longer communist. Yeah, I know the Communist Party still runs China, but they really have a fascist economic system, meaning they allow private ownership in China, but the state has a lot of control of what happens. and it looks pretty successful. And we really don't know how successful fascism would be economically. Obviously, there's the Nazi Germany model, but it only existed for, National Socialist Germany only existed 6 years before it was in a wartime footing. So it's hard to judge an economy, but for those 6 years, it really turned around the economy. And China seems to be doing pretty well too. So it's an interesting model, and I think we're seeing more and more of it. Now, they're never going to call it fascism, but that's what it is when you have private property and you have state control over the property. And whereas the goal under communism is equality and make everyone exactly the same. Of course, that never happens, but that's the stated goal. And socialism, like they used to have in the Nordic countries, was to reduce inequality and social welfare. We had the big welfare states. Whereas fascism was more about national power. You don't want to necessarily eliminate economic classes, or they try to reduce them, but you want what's good for the whole nation. And so in this situation, Trump is getting the United States ownership of Intel, not to create equality or something like that, or get rid of the bourgeois. And it's not trying to set up a social welfare state. It's trying to help protect America. So that is where we are right now. It's an interesting concept on an economic level, and I think it's a system that we're going to see more and more if there's more and more success with it. Again, China is an example of that. And again, China, they'd probably get the vapors if you called it a fascist economic system, but that's what it is. They'll come up with another word. In fact, they have. But anytime you have, again, you have communism, which is total control. There's no private property. The government controls everything. Anytime communism has been attempted, it's been a total economic disaster because there's no competition and there's all sorts of problems. I'm not going to explain why, but you can see it just leads to big poverty, shortages. It's a disaster, right? And then you have socialism that you had in Western Europe, especially in the 60s and 70s, where you have super high taxes. You're trying to reduce inequality, and you may nationalize certain businesses, but you do have some private ownership. And that your idea is to reduce inequality. And that has been, it doesn't really create a big powerhouse engine like modern day China. You tend to have a country economically that is held back, and it's not as poor as you get in communism, but there's a lack of innovation. And then you have capitalism that we've been in, or totally free markets, that produces the most wealth, the most innovation. But the problem is, as we see what has happened recently, it only concerns about money, and there's more to life than money, right? And eventually, Lenin used to say that capitalists will sell you the rope to hang themselves. And there's some truth to that. So it's like a very short-term focus. And it's like, oh, we can make a lot more money by sending the stuff over to China. Yay, we get bigger profits. But then China gets more powerful and conquers us. So what did that really, long term, it didn't have the desired result. So that's the only problem with capitalism potentially. And then fascism economic model is where you have private ownership, but the government, for the good of the nation, says, no, you're not going to outsource our jobs because it hurts our people. And we're not going to outsource our industry because, hell, that's a national security risk, and which we see right now with the silly war we're having with Russia and Ukraine. Part of the issue was like, oh, more weapons to Ukraine. Well, we don't have the weapons, and we don't build those weapons very quickly. And we're dependent upon Taiwan, China, and a lot of other places to slowly build these weapons. Whereas in Russia, they have the factories there. China is the powerhouse more than the United States now. And so I think people are really going to have to relook at the whole economic models. And again, for political reasons, I don't think they could call the economic system fascism just because of all the baggage. Because again, the propaganda, whenever you think of fascism, you think of military uniforms, tanks, and all that. But that's not what it originally meant. It was the economic system. But it's too. I think it's too. The word is too dirty, discredited now, so they can implement it without calling it that word. And I think that makes people happier. That's what they've done in China. In China, they don't call it a fascist economic system, even though technically that's what it is. They call it something like communism with a Chinese variant or something like that. I'm like, oh, the variant is fascism. So technically what Trump is doing here is a little bit of fascism, where the government, the state, takes control of an industry or part of the industry. I don't have a problem with that. I think that something like that needs to happen, but we will see what happens with that. But it is a big step that the United States is investing in Intel, and it looks like long term. And again, the United States has, especially the last couple decades, has stepped in for businesses again, like General Motors, and of course the banks, but it's always temporarily. It's just temporary. They take over the industry, or they take over a large portion of the business, then they turn it back over. The goal here is not to do that. So this is a major step. So that's the number one story of the day. Trump invests America 10% into Intel. And I guess a good thing, if Intel makes a lot of money, that will go back to the taxpayer, to the country. All right, the number two story, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but this is the stuff with John Bolton is a little bit more serious. And let's take a look at this. John Bolton is basically, you can make an argument, has engaged in treason. And let's listen to this clip here.
This might have nothing to do with classified documents or about classified intelligence that Bolton printed in his book. Trump Justice Insider Mike Davis says Democrats, rhinos, and reporters who think this raid on John Bolton is about his book will be very embarrassed when the search warrant becomes public.
So what they're saying here, what this guy is saying, is a lot of people are saying, okay, so John Bolton had classified information that he put in his book, and that may be true. That's a criminal action. But he's implying, no, this goes deeper than that.
Primetime's hearing Bolton was making a lot of money from overseas and may have been trafficking in intelligence. That wouldn't be putting America first. Constitutional scholar John.
And who would he be trafficking with? He's made a lot of money overseas. That should be a red flag. But who is he giving intelligence to? We know John Bolton loves Israel more than any other country. So the question is, was he giving the information to Israel? I think there's a high probability.
Jonathan Turley, who we just heard from, says Bolton could be looking at up to 20 years in prison. So Bolton should take his own advice and take a big, beautiful, deep breath.
I think it's important that everybody take a deep breath here. This is a very serious matter, and it would be better.
So, yeah, this is a serious matter for Bolton. And if I had a guess, I would think he had classified material and he provided it to Israel because he thought, again, he was safe. He didn't have to worry about it. And he didn't think Trump would gain power again, but he miscalculated. And now, even though Trump loves Israel, still giving secrets to a foreign power it's a treasonous offense. So we will see. That could be we will see what it is. But according to the Trump Insider, it's more than just publishing secrets in a book. All right. Speaking of Israel again, and the problems we're having here, and we shouldn't have to deal with this. And I think a lot of values of other cultures aren't compatible with ours. And what happened here? TikTok, because TikTok, remember, was about to be banned. And then Trump stepped in to save it because, it's Chinese influence. Well, now TikTok has overhauled its hate speech, and they hired someone to deal with the censorship, a Jewish lady that was a former IDF instructor, self-described proud Zionist. And what she's doing, they're changing their so-called hate speech. And again, a hate speech is not an American concept. It's a foreign concept. It's a totalitarian concept. And so what she's doing here, they're narrowing the policy on supremacy from covering all racial supremacy to only white supremacy. And she's doing this because she's Jewish. So she wants to make it as fine if Jewish people want to say they're God's chosen people, they're better than other people, and they have a right to a homeland. That, to her, obviously she supports, and no one should be censored for that, especially on TikTok. And these type of groups are not really worried about Black supremacy. So if Blacks want to say they're superior and Black nationalism, it's you go, girl. They're just targeting white people. And this is always what happens. These sort of people, they have a hatred to whites and Christians specifically. And we're seeing this now. And I would argue someone like her should not be in charge of TikTok. And I would like to see Trump get a national interest in TikTok and get someone that has more American values, which obviously a lot of these groups, they do not. Her values are Israeli, which aren't American. But that is the problem we have there. So that's number 3, a woman that had ties to the Israelis, an IDF instructor, having trouble speaking today. An IDF instructor has changed their hate speech policy that only supremacy that deals with whites is considered hate speech, definitely not for Jews. And she is Jewish. So surprise, surprise. All right. The number 4 story we have here, and this is happening in Austria. It's really sad. Some great people have come from Austria. I'm just saying, like Mozart, right? So I don't know, maybe some others too. But here's what's happening now.
Sharia law is now valid in Austria. In a landmark legal decision widely condemned by locals, the court ruled that a contract made between 2 businessmen using Sharia law is valid in the country. One of the parties had taken the case to the court, pointing out Sharia's arbitrary nature, often being subject to wildly differing interpretations by scholars, and its fundamental violation of Austrian law and its principles. But the court slapped the argument down, explicitly stating the Sharia agreement didn't contradict Austrian values, and ruled that Islamic legal provisions could, quote, be effectively agreed upon in an arbitration agreement.
So what they're doing here, this is a huge thing, is it puts a lie to immigrants are coming into our countries. They shouldn't be in Austria anyway. They have their own countries. But they go into Austria because they can't create that living standard for a variety of reasons. And then they set up their own communities. They don't assimilate into Austria. They have a separate nation. And this is always unstable. So they are now, even in legal terms, have a different legal system than real Austrians. And that is just going to create conflict. And this is an example of how diversity doesn't work, because the Muslims that come into Austria, obviously they like the wealth that they aren't able to create in their countries. However, they really hate the Austrians. They want to have their own system of religion and their own legal framework. And this is what happens when you have unlimited immigration. You have a right to have your own homeland. And I support this. Getting back to Israel, I support Israel's right to have their own Jewish homeland. Obviously, the Jewish people in Israel would not tolerate this. A bunch of Muslims coming in and implementing Sharia law, the ADL be freaking out, crying. They say, we have a right to our homeland. Oh, how dare you? You know, and all the evangelicals would be crying. Well, we have the same right. We have the same right, and we don't have to bring all these people in. And the ones that are in, obviously, they're not compatible, and they need to go back to their homelands. And again, it's not a matter of the wrong or right. I mean, I think we're right, but I'm with our people. But if they want to live under Sharia law, well, they have their own countries in which they could live in Sharia law. Don't put that in our countries. And we're going to see this more and more. It's going to happen in Britain and Sweden and elsewhere. And I think people are understanding now that globalism is really coming to an end. I think in many ways it has ended. We're in the death throes right now. People are realizing, no, diversity isn't a strength. You put in a bunch of people together, they're not going to live under like the Star Trek fantasy model. There's just going to be conflict. There's reasons we have different nations. It doesn't make us stronger. In fact, it brings us down. It creates violence and turmoil. And I think that people are starting to understand that more. It wasn't that long ago, people non-ironically would say, oh, diversity is our strength, and bringing in a bunch of these people, let's say from Pakistan into Austria or Sweden, they would say, oh, that's enriching us, enrichment. Now they only say the term enrichment in an ironic fashion. You're joking about it. You know it's not enriching. It just impoverishes you, and it lowers your whole community. And it brings in more violence. It brings in more friction. And even if it didn't, it's changing the way you live. And you have the right to have your homeland, your customs, your language, your people, right? You have that right. And that's why I always argue for nationalism. It's not always about crime. And when I'm opposed to huge immigration into the United States, yeah, a lot of these people are criminals. And a lot of the people, they don't have our values, like those illegal Indians, truck drivers that just did a U-turn, killed 3 people. Yeah, that's a problem, but that's not the only reason I want them out. They're not compatible with our culture. And I would say the censor in TikTok, she's not compatible with American culture. I mean, maybe she's more compatible with Israeli culture, censoring other ideas, but it doesn't really fit here. And we need to understand that more. And my 5th story, see if I have time for this. Yeah, we'll go over this real quick here. I found this really interesting, and it's this African lady. And we'll just see part of this video. And this is actually, I think people should watch this more, understand what she's saying here. So let's listen to this black lady. I think she's African.
What if I told you that for many African societies, the concept of the future doesn't exist, and that instead of time moving forwards, time actually moves backwards? This was the work of John Mbiti, one of Kenya's and Africa's greatest philosophers. And in 1969, he wrote something that completely reimagines the way we think of African time. Mbiti says time is a 2-dimensional phenomenon with a long past, vibrant present, and virtually no future. Using Swahili words, he describes the 2 dimensions of time. The first one being sasa, the now, the recent past, and the immediate future, which can be experienced. The second dimension is zamani. Zamani is the vast, endless past where all events eventually go on to live forever. But the future in African thought, it barely exists because time is made up of events. Time has to be experienced in order to be real. So because we can't conceptualize events tied to the distant future because they haven't been experienced yet, then therefore the future cannot constitute part of time. And this is...
So, and this explains a lot. So what she's saying, and this was an African scholar, but so what he's saying is that Africans, their view of time is different than Asians or Westerns. Their thought processes are different. And this is one of the dangers of assuming racial or ethnic differences is just superficial differences like skin color. It's actually way, way more deep, as we see here. And in African thought, according to this scholar from Ethiopia or Kenya or wherever he was from, they have a past and they have the present and an immediate future. Like if the doorbell rings, then, oh, I know within in a minute, someone's out there outside the door. So they have that sense of the future. But further, the long-term future, they have no concept of. And they can't have a concept of it. They're not wired that way. And you see this with some other, in the animal kingdom, you see this. I would say like dogs, really, they live in the present. And they have somewhat a memory of the past, but they don't think long term. Like my dog doesn't think, oh, what am I going to do 5 years from now? A dog doesn't think that way because they can't. And it's nothing wrong with the dog. My dog is pretty smart, but it just can't do that. And people have differences too. And this explains why we see a lot of different behavior, especially in Africa. One of the classic things that has been repeated over and over and over, I've known people personally, I won't say who, but part of like Engineers Without Borders, they go to Africa, build some device or machinery for clean water, a clean water facility, because they have dirty water. How sad, they need to have clean water, clean drinking water. And the people are happy at the time, the Africans. But then once they leave, the facility immediately gets torn apart and for scrap metal, because they can sell the copper and stuff and get money. And it's just not looters. This is their culture does it. And they don't really see anything wrong with it. And for our point of view, a European Western point of view, it's like, why are you doing that? You're going to be back in your same situation in the future where you won't have clean drinking water. Yeah, immediately, if you sell the copper, you can get some money. But for all of you, and even for your own benefit, it's better not to tear it apart. Let it keep running, maintain it, because this will give you clean water 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. But the problem is, according to this theory and this African scholar, they have no way to understand 10 years from now, 20 years from now. That doesn't make any sense to them. It can't make sense to them because it's not real. As she said, it's not real. Only thing's real is what's happening now, maybe the immediate future, like a few minutes in the future, and the past, but the future is not real. And so they can't even conceive of it. So waiting 5, 10, 15 years, it boggles their mind. And you see this in other things too. I once saw, and there's been a lot of experiments on this, but I saw this one video clip years ago. This youth got arrested because he, I don't know what he did. He hit someone in the head, knocked him out on the subway, robbed him. And the judge was saying, well, how would you like that if that happened to you? You were just standing there waiting for the train and someone hit you for no reason in your head. How would that make you feel if that happened to you? And the youth, he wasn't trolling. He couldn't understand that. He just said, but I wasn't hit in the head. And the judge's like, no, I know you weren't, but let's pretend it was you and you would have been hit in the head. How would have that made you feel? And again, he wasn't trying to be cute. It was just he had like a blank stare, like, I don't know what you're talking about. I wasn't hit in the head. This question doesn't make any sense. So there's a layer of abstraction that, according to this theory, is impossible. It doesn't go across all humanity. And that would explain a lot of differences, especially long-term planning. Certain cultures, maybe how through evolution in different climates, there wasn't a need for long-term planning. You just could exist in the now because food is plentiful years round. But in other areas, I would say especially northern areas, the people that didn't do long-term planning, they did not survive to reproduce because you'd be killed by the winters. So you had to plan and abstract for the future. So it's an interesting thing. And again, it was a African scholar that came up with this, that in the Africa thought, they really don't have a concept as we do of the future, which would explain a lot. And then the question is, can you give them that concept, or is it just no way they're ever going to get that concept? But that has profound implications on everything of how you live your life. If you just live it in your immediate gratification and the future is not real and you can't even think of that. So interesting thing there. Anyway, guys, thank you for being here. It's been fun as usual. And I will talk to you guys again. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.